Good morning, and welcome back to 5 a.m. Story Talk, a place to talk about stories in all their forms, the craft that goes into them, and the role that art plays in our lives. I'm Cole Haddon, and I'm on my third cup of coffee today. What about you guys? How are you doing? This week's episode is another of what I'm calling mini-sodes, though I hope by now you've worked out that mini-sodes are not exactly mini in scope. I'm trying to tackle stories from my career, big craft questions, and even bigger questions about our culture in 15 to 25 minutes. Are you enjoying them? I am, at least the recording part of the experience. I've mentioned this before, but I'm not an actor. The thought of acting makes me squirm. Seriously, squirm. So it's taken me a lot of time to work out how to do this. But now that I found my comfort zone, I'm having a blast. This week, I'm going to be talking about a TV series that became one of my favorites of all time almost, well, instantaneously. A TV series that I would also argue is one of the greatest ever made. I'm talking about Andor here. Its second and final season wrapped up a couple months ago, and while I think a lot has already been said about it, I'd like to add to that discourse while simultaneously offering up a pretty dramatic reconsideration of George Lucas's two Star Wars trilogies. So let's talk about what Tony Gilroy's series has to say about the 21st century, America, and fascism, our blind devotion to ancient religions and their ideas of good and evil, and why maybe, just maybe, the Jedi had it coming. A provocative statement to be sure, but I hope you hear me out. Sacred cows are obviously not safe here at 5 a.m. Story Talk. Minisodes like these might seem like talking head editorials on a subject, just me rambling on, but I hope they're more than that. Media literacy is in the gutter in 2025, so I'm trying to help us learn how to better interrogate art, and thus our culture. But also, if you're a storyteller, especially those just beginning to hone their craft, it's important to learn how to analyze, dissect, and reframe other people's art in order to improve your own. I'm going to be doing that a lot here, helping you learn how to learn yourself, and that's probably because I think outright instruction doesn't work so well when it comes to the arts. Now, before we get started, I want to also remind you to check out this episode's show notes where you'll be able to subscribe to the 5 a.m. Story Talk newsletter for free and find links to many of the things discussed today. Every week, I post new articles and essays about the arts there. If you become a paid subscriber at Substack, you'll get access to loads of exclusive content, including bonus episodes of this podcast. Lastly, I want to remind you that baby podcasts like 5 a.m. Story Talk need word-of-mouth help to grow up. The 10 to 30 seconds you spend subscribing, giving it 5 stars, or leaving a comment about what you enjoy so much about what I'm doing here can make a gigantic difference to its future. Now, let's get into Andor and the dilemma of moral absolutism in Star Wars and our culture. The concept of the duality of man has been part of the human story for so long, nobody quite knows where it originated. But the general definition of it, that our species contains both good and evil, is so commonplace in the history of our mythologies that we can safely assume it's baked into our race memory at this point. Unfortunately, it's in this attempt to explain our contradictory nature that things have become muddled in history, as most cultures have never been comfortable with the idea that humans are morally imperfect beings. For millennia now, the favorite explanation for our moral deficits has been to reduce our complicated, incredibly messy world into literal good and evil, with great big capital letters, and then externalizing these forces any way we can so we can actively battle against the latter. This dichotomy is epitomized by the roles of God and Satan in Judeo-Christian beliefs. George Lucas understood this very well when he used his deep knowledge of Occidental mythology to dream up the Star Wars prequel and original trilogies, long-billed space fantasies. In them, the relationship between good and evil manifests as the light and dark side of the Force, and for nearly 5 decades, the cosmic battle between Jedi and Sith, two cults trapped in an endless religious war, has captivated audiences by elevating supernatural beings over the agency of mere mortals. Andor, from creator Tony Gilroy, reveals how flawed this approach was, and in hurling the franchise's light-dark mythology out the writer's room window, delivers one of the greatest TV series ever produced. Nothing I'm about to tell you should suggest I have not always loved and will always love Lucas's Star Wars films, but my relationship to them shouldn't defy how I and the world around me have changed. I'm reminded of a scene in the 1995 film 12 Monkeys, in which the past is compared to our relationship to cinema. A character observes, the movie never changes. It can't change, but every time you see it, it seems different because you're different. And that's the key, isn't it? Because you're different. I believe we can better understand who we are as a culture and as individuals by constantly interrogating our most closely held beliefs about art. If art is a mirror held up to society, then we must accept that what it shows us can and will change as we change. This means it would be a mistake to treat Star Wars as a sacred cow by refusing to let its role in our culture evolve. So let's reconsider, in my typically serpentine fashion, the prequel and original trilogies through the lens of what Andor has to say about our 21st century society and our generally blind devotion to ancient religions and their ideas of good and evil. By the time I was 25, my best friend had found Jesus at a megachurch and gotten engaged to the first woman there who seemed to pay him any attention. Actually, I take that back. The first female member of the congregation who paid him any attention filleted him on their first date, which he immediately professed great shame over. You might wonder, what does this anecdote have to do with Star Wars? Surely they were watching it when she went down on him, right? No, they weren't. Or at least I assume they weren't. I never asked, which would have been weird, right? For now, I ask that you simply go with the story. A month after receiving his apparently disgraceful blowjob, my best friend met his future wife, and for the rest of their engagement, they spent every opportunity they could to inform me about the temptation of sin and the terrible nature of evil I was leaving myself open to by not immediately embracing Jesus Christ as my ultimate Lord and Savior. To grasp how quickly and supremely their minds had been warped, I was advised I shouldn't watch Schindler's List. Schindler's List, because a man such as myself couldn't help lusting after the naked bodies of the Jewish women being led to their deaths in gas chambers. Evil, for evangelicals such as these, was an ever-present threat, very similar to the dark side. Satan did not take vacations, and the only way to protect ourselves against this wily influence was by cutting ourselves off from all earthly pleasures and other temptations, just like the Jedi did, and of course armoring ourselves with the spirit of a dead Jewish carpenter who may or may not have ever existed. This dead Jewish man would return one day, I was told, to fulfill his promise as a kind of chosen one, to vanquish Satan's evil for good and welcome all his faithful flock into heaven for an eternity. Ultimately, I became so uncomfortable around my friend's wife, whose understanding of the world seemed to match the one I had at 10 years old when I was still forced to attend Sunday school. I broke it to my best friend of half a decade, and a friend since junior high school, that I couldn't know him anymore because I genuinely believed his wife would try to harm people, including me, if she imagined her deity told her to do so. He told me I was crazy, and I had to chuckle because this is the same guy who had tried to convince me on several occasions that Satan had put dinosaur and ancient hominid fossils in the earth to test the Christian God's faithful. For a while now, I found myself conflicted by the role of the Force in Star Wars, or rather the role of non-Force users in the ongoing storyline. The way in which these characters exist almost as an afterthought to the spiritual conflict being waged between the Jedi and Sith. Consider Alderaan. It gets blown up in A New Hope, and we never hear about it or its billions of dead again. Princess Leia Organa struggles with the loss of her entire culture for mere screen seconds before she's flinging quippy insults at her rescuers on the first Death Star. This indifference to civilian casualties and deaths is universal in all three Star Wars trilogies and fairly consistent throughout the franchise. If you're not a Jedi, you matter very little in terms of character work is the point. It's important to note, I'm talking about characters we love here. Leia has zero character arc through the original trilogy. Chewbacca? Nada. He really is nothing more than the family pet. Han goes from a rogue criminal to heroic good guy, at least that's an arc, but never gets to sacrifice his life, which would have solidified that transformation. The most interesting character arc outside of Luke's and Darth Vader's Force-related stories turns out to be Lando Calrissian's, which was at least morally complicated. By the time the prequels arrived more than a decade later, we got more non-Force users like Jar Jar Binks, whose arc is idiot to useful idiot, and actually, that's it, besides our lone female protagonist, Padme Amidala. The thing is, Padme has even less of an arc than her daughter did, because Padme is just there to be Anakin Skywalker's crush and then get murdered by him. It doesn't matter how intelligent or strong she's written, or how many bad guys she blasters down. She was never going to make a bigger difference to her galaxy than leaving a Sith Lord weepy. Yes, there is the sequel trilogy, but somehow the non-Force users are treated even worse there. What I'm saying here is, Star Wars has always been about Jedi and Sith, and only Jedi and Sith. Characters who don't possess a faculty for the Force, who are not adherents of a hokey religion as Han refers to it in A New Hope, are perpetually caught up in the lives of those who do. They exist, they're part of the bigger story, but they're only really there as non-player characters in the eternal war of the Jedi and Sith. It's a feeling I often have when watching the news today, that we're all trapped in a world run by people cosplaying mythological scenarios, utterly divorced from objective reality. This lack of existential agency on the part of non-Force users in the prequel and original trilogies was narratively convenient for George Lucas because it means that the ideology of the Jedi and their religious absolutism never gets challenged in any serious way. For example, Luke Skywalker never discusses the space cult he just joined with Han or Leia Organa, giving them a chance to poke holes in his fantastic claims. He only gets into this topic with his fellow cultists like Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda. This means that audiences have no reason to question the Jedi or any of their religious claims either. We accept them as noble truth along with the Force dichotomy, light and dark, as law. Even when Luke's good Jedi masters push him to assassinate his own evil father, even lying to him to trick him into doing it, we never question their ethics or morality. Jedi are good, everything else is evil. George Lucas said so. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. George W. Bush made this declaration 10 days after September 11, 2001. It was yet another reminder that the United States perceived itself to be a force of good, and to even question that position made you its enemy. Not shockingly, many around the globe accepted and embraced the role of antagonist to such moral absolutism. In the prequels, we finally see what happens when a Jedi is forced to defend himself against the common sense of the real world. Luke Skywalker's father, Anakin, attempts to debate politics with his senator crush, Padme Amidala. Big mistake, because in doing so he reveals how juvenile he is. His answer to legislative gridlock is to essentially abolish democracy and replace it with a dictator. Padme reacts, aghast, and insists the better solution is to work to change the system. Democracy is hard, after all. The audience reacts similarly to Anakin's words, recognizing thinking that will lead to his fall to the dark side and eventual resurrection as the right hand of a dictator. As Darth Vader, he will kill Padme, his own wife. She becomes one of millions of victims in Star Wars of ancient religions projecting their endless conflict and binary moral code on a galaxy where things aren't so black and white. Alright, yes, it's fair to point out that Anakin is not espousing Jedi ideology here. But what he is espousing is a direct response to the moral failings of that ideology. What I mean is, the Jedi are far more responsible for Anakin's fall than future Emperor Palpatine's manipulations. They refuse to allow him to mourn the loss of his mother, they tell him he's to deny himself basic human connections, and they turn him into a holy warrior whose only choice is to hide his confusion and terror from the very people who are meant to be caring for him. Why the hell would Anakin trust the Jedi Order's approach to anything as sound? His response to Padme about how to fix democracy isn't petulant because of his religious conditioning. In fact, it's incredibly clear-eyed in hindsight. This is why Anakin is such a wonderful character, despite how he was received at the time of the prequel's releases. If you recruit a dumb kid into your cult, fail to educate him about anything other than your religious doctrine, and tell him he's a peacekeeper, before you then order him to go mass murder a military opponent, while simultaneously assuring him everything in the universe can only be understood as good and evil, then of course his only choice when confronted with your hypocritical flaws will be to turn to the opposing force. If the Jedi have become this flawed, then of course the Sith must be right, which means if the Jedi support the Republic, then the Republic must be a problem too. There's just no other choice presented, not a lick of gray between the two. Well, at least not in George Lucas's Star Wars. 4 years after George W. Bush told the world it was either with the United States or against it in its so-called war against terror, Anakin Skywalker would rage against his friend, Obi-Wan Kenobi. "If you are not with me, then you are my enemy." Many assume Lucas used this line as a direct reference to Bush's patriotic bloviating. The effect of it on audiences actually reinforced the Jedi's own binary thinking of the universe rather than incriminated Anakin. "Only a Sith deals in absolutes," Obi-Wan tells his Padawan, as if the Jedi don't traffic in the exact same moral proclamations. Years later, Yoda will tell Anakin's son Luke, "Once you start down the dark path, forevermore will it dominate your destiny." No room for mistakes, no room for growth, no wiggle room to acknowledge that not every problem in the galaxy has only two kinds of solutions. Just the same kind of childlike approach to existence that my best friend and his wife had embraced when they were saved by their megachurch. Yeah, sure, Obi-Wan. Obviously, Anakin thinks like a Sith, because that's how you and the Jedi taught him to think. I couldn't tell you what the thematic through line of the Star Wars sequels is. I still can't explain them in any way that could hold up to a critical interrogation. But I do know there was a horrible backlash from some Star Wars fans to the interpretation of Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi. The last time we'd seen Luke, and I don't mean his brief cameo at the end of The Force Awakens, he'd become a Jedi like his father before him, not by embracing the religion's dogmatic rigidity, but by abandoning it. He put his faith not in archaic rules written countless generations before, but in human connections denied to his father, in his friends, and ultimately the ghost of Anakin Skywalker rattling around somewhere inside Darth Vader's armor. In other words, he was a new way forward for the Jedi. Maybe this is why I was able to embrace The Last Jedi as one of my favorites in the Star Wars series. Because I saw a man who had, in his attempt to become a new kind of Jedi Grandmaster, a new kind of High Priest of the light side, inadvertently apply the same flawed thinking of his predecessors. It's not as if he had any other teachers. So when Luke looks into the future and sees Ben Solo will destroy everything he built, he again almost repeats the sin of his own mentor, Obi-Wan Kenobi, who also killed, or thought he had, someone he loved to protect the galaxy. This is exactly what both Obi-Wan and Yoda had ordered Luke to do on Dagobah as well. Luke's temptation isn't the dark side in this case. It's to follow the old Jedi way that had led his own masters to behave in such morally reprehensible ways. That's what Ben Solo reacts to, turning him to the dark side instead, just as Anakin Skywalker had once reacted to the old Jedi way. There it is again, right? If the Jedi are wrong, then the opposing force must be right. That's an incredibly binary way of thinking, but it's what happens when you reduce the universe to the light and the dark side, to good and evil, which is exactly what we've continued to do in the 21st century, trying to reduce our complicated world, one full of endless contradictions and necessary compromises, to a man-made dichotomy that made no sense 5,000 years ago and makes even less sense today. Whoever is not with me is against me. If you're not familiar with these words, they're spoken by Jesus Christ in the book of Matthew. In the battle between God and Satan, between good and evil, there really is no middle ground. For years, we've all been told the only interesting thing about Star Wars was the Jedi and the Sith, lightsabers and lightning fingers, dynasties and destinies. You get the picture. It couldn't survive without these things, which is of course why Jedi in particular were shoehorned into almost every Star Wars story created for the screen. Star Wars was a fantasy, plain and simple. If you wanted science fiction, you could always check out Star Trek. But then, Andor happened. Creator Tony Gilroy's narrative masterstroke was stripping the franchise of its allegedly most important ingredient, the Force. The result? You're left with a world where nothing is binary. There is no light side and dark side or problematic ancient codes dictating how to be good or evil, though the events exist in the fallout of that war. No, there is only chaos, from which democracy and freedom must be prized by characters who constantly question if they've gone too far. They don't commit atrocities with moral certainty. They commit them constantly aware they are losing themselves, that they trade their lives for a future they can't even necessarily imagine yet. And they do them so that we in the audience are forced to ask ourselves if what we're cheering for are acts of heroic rebellion or brutal acts of terrorism. Or maybe, just maybe, they're both. Because freedom is as messy as our world, especially when fascism, imperialism, colonialism, and so on are involved. And trying to explain why human beings do anything by resorting to ancient ideas of good and evil is as childish and intellectually lazy as Anakin Skywalker's answer to a problematic democracy. Yes, human beings contain ugly multitudes, but we are also capable of profound love, beauty, and sacrifice for the greater good. What we most definitely aren't is the playthings of external forces of supernatural good and evil. Instead, we're the victims of those who believe we are, all of us forced to somehow survive the imaginary battle between deities and devils they're waging with real-world consequences. George Lucas's Star Wars embraced Occidental mythology much to our delight, but that meant the most culturally destructive parts of it too. The myth of the Holy War, the myth of the Chosen One, the myth of ancient destinies. Nearly 50 years later, Gilroy and his writers presented an alternative version of a galaxy far, far away. One that reflects our real world, where good guys do bad things and evil is banal rather than magical. Put another way, Lucas wanted us to be afraid of Sith Lords, while Gilroy believes the most successful monsters are morally rudderless office managers and bureaucrats trying to score a promotion. I checked out a couple of social media feeds today. The distinct approaches to Star Wars that I've just described played out across all of them, but with regard to real-world events instead. On one side were people who seem to believe our world is caught up in a great battle between forces of good and evil that requires everyone who doesn't agree with them to be denounced as anti-whatever or pro-whatever. Label it whatever you need to. But all resolutions must comport to their apocalyptic conflict narrative. On the other side were people arguing everything is confusing and terrible, and maybe we should just try to find a way to salvage something out of the chaos and trauma, even if it's going to be wildly imperfect. Of course, the summary I just offered is clearly two-sided, but it's a very different one than I've been discussing in this essay, which is, do we choose the convenient fantasy of George Lucas's Star Wars, or do we choose the difficult reality of Tony Gilroy's Andor? One provides the false promise of a happy ending. The other accepts everything is always going to be shit. But what matters is we keep fighting, together, against the seemingly impossible odds stacked against us, in an attempt to create something less shit. At my 20th high school reunion, I ran into my old best friend and warmly greeted him and his wife. I'd missed him despite how we'd fallen out. I expressed my regret over how things had ended between us, at which point he leaned in close so I could hear him over the music, and quickly and succinctly summed up what had happened in this way. "We've done a lot of growing up since then," he told me. "We've learned things aren't so black and white." I left the reunion feeling oddly hopeful about the world. So, what do you think about my arguments about Star Wars? Get into the comments right now and let me know. As always, thanks for listening, my friends. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd really appreciate it if you dropped a 5-star rating on it or give me a thumbs up if you're on YouTube or Substack. But most importantly, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more of what I'm doing here at 5 a.m. Story Talk. Next week, I'll be joined by Indigenous Australian artist Black Douglas, who's one of my favorite Aussie fine artists working in the country today. He won the Archibald Prize for Portraiture a few years ago with an image that instantly became iconic in my mind. It now hangs on the wall of the Welcome Plaza of the Art Gallery of New South Wales. I have to say I'm incredibly grateful to Black for being so open with me about his experience as a First Nations artist and the history of Aboriginal people in Australia. I think we get into a lot of subjects that aren't commonly discussed in the country, which might even shock some Aussies. It's going to be a provocative episode for many reasons, I think it's safe to say. Okay, that's it for now. I'll see you for some more story talk next week, my friends.